was the rebellion at Attica Prison in final autopsy was in, even before later disclosures suggested a government plot to kill Jackson, that he had been murdered for daring to be a revolutionary in prison. Shortly after Jackson's death, there was a chain of rebellions around the country. In San Jose Civic Center Jail, in Dallas County Jail, in Suffolk County Jail in Boston, in Cumberland County Jail in Bridgeton, New Jersey, in Bexar County Jail in San Antonio, Texas. The most direct effect of the George Jackson murder was the rebellion at Attica Prison in September 1971. A rebellion that came from long, deep grievances, but that was raised to a boiling point by the news about George Jackson. Attica was surrounded by a 30-foot wall, 2 feet thick with 14 gun towers. 54% of the inmates were black. 100% of the guards were white. Prisoners spent 14 to 16 hours a day in their cells. Their mail was read, their reading material restricted, their visits from families conducted through a mesh screen, their medical care disgraceful, their parole system inequitable, racism everywhere. How perceptive the prison administration was about these conditions can be measured by the comment of the superintendent of Attica, Vincent Mancusi, when the uprising began. Why are they destroying their home? Most of the Attica prisoners were there as a result of plea bargaining. Of 32,000 felony indictments a year in New York State, 4,000 to 5,000 were tried. The rest, about 75%, were disposed of by deals made under duress called plea bargaining, described as follows in the report of the Joint Legislative Committee on Crime in New York. The final climactic act in the plea bargaining procedure is a charade which in itself has aspects of dishonesty, which rival the original crime in many instances. The accused is made to assert publicly his guilt on a specific crime, which in many cases he has not committed. In some cases, he pleads guilty to a non-existing crime. He must further indicate that he is entering his plea freely, and that he is not doing so because of any promises made to him. In plea bargaining, the accused pleads guilty, whether he is or not, and saves the state the trouble of a trial in return for the promise of a less severe punishment. When Attica prisoners were up for parole, the average time of their hearing, including the reading of the file and deliberation among the 3 members, was 5.9 minutes. Then the decision was handed out with no explanation. The official report on the Attica uprising tells how an inmate-instructed sociology class there became a forum for ideas about change. Then there was a series of organized protest efforts, and in July an inmate manifesto setting forth a series of moderate demands, after which tensions at Attica had continued to mount, culminating in a day of protest over the killing of George Jackson at San Quentin, during which few inmates ate at lunch and dinner, and many wore black armbands. On September 9, 1971, a series of conflicts between prisoners and guards ended with a group of inmates breaking through a gate with a defective weld and taking over one of the 4 prison yards with 40 guards as hostages. Then followed 5 days in which the prisoners set up a remarkable community in the yard. A group of citizen observers invited by the prisoners included New York Times columnist Tom Wicker, who wrote A Time to Die. The racial harmony that prevailed among the prisoners, it was absolutely astonishing. That prison yard was the first place I had ever seen where there was no racism. One black prisoner later said, "I never thought whites could really get it on, but I can't tell you what the yard was like. I actually cried. It was so close, everyone so together." After 5 days, the state lost patience. Governor Nelson Rockefeller approved a military attack on the prison. See Cinda Firestone's stunning film, Attica. National Guardsmen, prison guards, and local police went in with automatic rifles, carbines, and submachine guns in a full-scale assault on the prisoners who had no firearms. 31 prisoners were killed. The first stories given the press by prison authorities said that 9 guards held hostage had their throats slashed by the prisoners during the attack. The official autopsies almost immediately showed this to be false. The 9 guards died in the same hail of bullets that killed the prisoners. The effects of Attica are hard to measure. 2 months after the revolt at Attica, men at Norfolk Prison in Massachusetts began to organize. On November 8, 1971, armed guards and state troopers, in a surprise raid, moved into the cells at Norfolk, pulled out 16 men and shipped them out. A prisoner described the scene. Between 1 and 2 last night, I was awakened. I've been a light sleeper since Vietnam, and I looked out my window. There were troopers and screws, lots, armed with sidearms and big clubs. They were going into dorms and taking people, all kinds of people. They took a friend of mine. Being pulled outside in our underwear at 1:30 and bare feet by 2 troopers and a house screw. Looking at those troops with guns and masks and clubs, with the moon shining off the helmets, and the hate that you could see in their faces. Thinking that this is where these guys live, with the guns and the hate and the helmets and masks. And you're trying to wake up, flashing on Kent State and Jackson and Chicago and Attica. Most of all, Attica. That same week at Concord Prison in Massachusetts, another raid. It was as if everywhere, in the weeks and months after Attica, the authorities were taking preventive action to break up organizing efforts among the prisoners. Jerry Souza, a young leader of the prison reform movement at Concord, was taken away, dumped into Walpole in the middle of the night, and immediately put into 9 Block, the dreaded segregation unit. He had been there only a short time when he managed to get a report out to friends. The content of this report tells much about what was happening before and after Attica to the thinking of prisoners. We are writing a somber report regarding the circumstances and events leading up to and surrounding the death of prisoner Joseph Chesnulovich, which occurred here an hour ago in 9 Block. Since Christmas Eve, vicious prison guards here in 9 Block have created a reign of terror directed toward us prisoners. 4 of us have been beaten, 1 who was prisoner Donald King. In an attempt to escape constant harassment and inhuman treatment, prisoner George Hayes ate razor blades, and prisoner Fred Ahern swallowed a needle. They were both rushed to Mass General Hospital. This evening at 6 p.m., prison guards Baptist, Sainsbury, and Montiega turned a fire extinguisher containing a chemical foam on Joe, then slammed the solid steel door, sealing him in his cell, and walked away, voicing threats of, "We'll get that punk." At 9:25 p.m., Joe was found dead. Prison authorities as well as news media will label little Joe's death as suicide, but the men here in Block 9 who witnessed this murder know. But are we next? What was happening was the organization of prisoners, the caring of prisoners for one another, the attempt to take the hatred and anger of individual rebellion and turn it into collective effort for change. On the outside, something new was also happening. The development of prison support groups all over the country, the building of a body of literature about prisons. There were more studies of crime and punishment, a growing movement for the abolition of prisons on the grounds that they did not prevent crime or cure it, but expanded it. Alternatives were discussed, community houses in the short run, except for the incorrigibly violent, guaranteed minimum economic security in the long run. The prisoners were thinking about issues beyond prison, victims other than themselves and their friends. In Walpole Prison, a statement asking for American withdrawal from Vietnam was circulated. It was signed by every single prisoner, an amazing organizing feat by a handful of inmates. One Thanksgiving Day there, most of the prisoners, not only in Walpole but in 3 other prisons, refused to eat the special holiday meal, saying they wanted to bring attention to the hungry all over the United States. Prisoners worked laboriously on lawsuits, and some victories were won in the courts. The publicity around Attica, the community of support, had its effect. Although the Attica rebels were indicted on heavy charges and faced double and triple life terms, the charges were finally dropped. But in general, the courts declared their unwillingness to enter the closed, controlled world of the prison. And so the prisoners remained as they had been so long, on their own. Even where an occasional victory came in the courts, it turned out on close reading to leave things not much different. In 1973, Perpunier v. Martinez, the U.S. Supreme Court declared unconstitutional certain male censorship regulations of the California Department of Corrections. But when one looked closely, the decision, with all its proud language about First Amendment liberty, said, "We hold that censorship of prison mail is justified if the following criteria are met." When the censorship could be said to further an important or substantial government interest, or where it was in the substantial government interests of security, order, and rehabilitation, censorship would be allowed. In 1978, the Supreme Court ruled that the news media do not have guaranteed rights of access to jails and prisons. It ruled also that prison authorities could forbid inmates to speak to one another, assemble, or spread literature about the formation of a prisoners' union. It became clear, and prisoners seemed to know this from the start, that their condition would not be changed by law, but by protest, organization, resistance, the creation of their own culture, their own literature, the building of links with people on the outside. There were more outsiders now who knew about prisons. Tens of thousands of Americans had spent time behind bars in the civil rights and anti-war movements. They had learned about the prison system and could hardly forget their experiences. There was a basis now for breaking through the long isolation of the prisoners from the community and finding support there. In the mid-70s, this was beginning to happen. It was a time of upsurge. Women guarded in their very homes rebelled. Prisoners put out of sight and behind bars rebelled. The greatest surprise was still to come. It was thought that the Indians, once the only occupants of the continent, then pushed back and annihilated by the white invaders, would not be heard from again. In the last days of the year 1890, shortly after Christmas, the last massacre of Indians took place at Pine Ridge, South Dakota, near Wounded Knee Creek. Sitting Bull, the great Sioux leader, had just been assassinated by Indian police in the pay of the United States, and the remaining Sioux sought refuge at Pine Ridge, 120 men and 230 women and children, surrounded by U.S. cavalry with 2 Hotchkiss guns capable of hurling shells over 2 miles on a rise overlooking the camp. When the troopers ordered the Indians to turn over their weapons, one of them fired his rifle. The soldiers then let loose with their carbines, and the big guns on the hill shelled the teepees. When it was over, between 200 and 300 of the original 350 men, women, and children were dead. The 25 soldiers who died were mostly hit by their own shrapnel or bullets, since the Indians had only a few guns. The Indian tribes, attacked, subdued, starved out, had been divided up by putting them on reservations where they lived in poverty. In 1887, an Allotment Act tried to break up the reservations into small plots of land owned by individual Indians to turn them into American-type small farmers. But much of this land was taken by white speculators, and the reservations remained. Then, during the New Deal, with a friend of the Indians, John Collier, in charge of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, there was an attempt to restore tribal life. But in the decades that followed, no fundamental change took place. Many Indians stayed on the impoverished reservations. The younger ones often left. An Indian anthropologist said, "An Indian reservation is the most complete colonial system in the world that I know about." For a time, the disappearance or amalgamation of the Indians seemed inevitable. Only 300,000 were left at the turn of the century, from the original 1,000,000 or more in the area of the United States. But then the population began to grow again, as if a plant left to die refused to do so, began to flourish. By 1960, there were 800,000 Indians, half on reservations, half in towns all over the country. The autobiographies of Indians show their refusal to be absorbed by the white man's culture. One wrote, "Oh yes, I went to the white man's schools. I learned to read from school books, newspapers, and the Bible. But in time I found that these were not enough. Civilized people depend too much on man-made printed pages. I turned to the Great Spirit's book, which is the whole of his creation." A Hopi Indian named Sun Chief said, I had learned many English words and could recite part of the Ten Commandments. I knew how to sleep on a bed, pray to Jesus, comb my hair, eat with a knife and fork, and use a toilet. I had also learned that a person thinks with his head instead of his heart. Chief Luther Standing Bear, in his 1933 autobiography, From the Land of the Spotted Eagle, wrote, "True, the white man brought great change, but the varied fruits of his civilization, though highly colored and inviting, are sickening and deadening. And if it be part of the civilization to maim, rob, and thwart, then what is progress? I am going to venture that the man who sat on the ground in his teepee, meditating on life and its meaning, accepting the kinship of all creatures, and acknowledging unity with the universe of things, was infusing into his being the true essence of civilization." As the civil rights and anti-war movements developed in the 1960s, Indians were already gathering their energy for resistance, thinking about how to change their situation, beginning to organize. In 1961, 500 tribal and urban Indian leaders met in Chicago. Out of this came another gathering of university-educated young Indians who formed the National Indian Youth Council. Mel Tom, a Paiute Indian, their first president, wrote, "There is increased activity over on the Indian side. There are disagreements, laughing, singing, outbursts of anger, and occasionally some planning. Indians are gaining confidence and courage that their cause is right. The struggle goes on. Indians are gathering together to deliberate their destiny." Around this time, Indians began to approach the United States government on an embarrassing topic, treaties. In his widely read 1969 book, Custer Died for Your Sins, Vine Deloria Jr. noted that President Lyndon Johnson talked about America's commitments, and President Nixon talked about Russia's failure to respect treaties. He said, "Indian people laugh themselves sick when they hear those statements." The United States government had signed more than 400 treaties with Indians and violated every single one. For instance, back in George Washington's administration, a treaty was signed with the Iroquois of New York. The United States acknowledged all the land within the aforementioned boundaries to be the property of the Seneca Nation. But in the early 60s, under President Kennedy, the United States ignored the treaty and built a dam on this land, flooding most of the Seneca Reservation. Resistance was already taking shape in various parts of the country. In the state of Washington, there was an old treaty taking land from the Indians, but leaving them fishing rights. This became unpopular as the white population grew and wanted the fishing areas exclusively for themselves. When state courts closed river areas to Indian fishermen in 1964, Indians had fish-ins on the Nisqually River in defiance of the court orders and went to jail hoping to publicize their protest. A local judge the following year ruled that the Puyallup tribe did not exist and its members could not fish on the river named for them, the Puyallup River. Policemen raided Indian fishing groups, destroyed boats, slashed nets, manhandled people, arrested 7 Indians. A Supreme Court ruling in 1968 confirmed Indian rights under the treaty, but said a state could regulate all fishing if it did not discriminate against Indians. The state continued to get injunctions and to arrest Indians fishing. They were doing to the Supreme Court ruling what whites in the South had done with the 14th Amendment for many years, ignoring it. Protests, raids, arrests continued into the early 70s. Some of the Indians involved in the fish-ins were veterans of the Vietnam War. One was Sid Mills, who was arrested in a fish-in at Frank's Landing on the Nisqually River in Washington on October 13, 1968. He made a statement. "I am a Yakima and Cherokee Indian and a man. For 2 years and 4 months, I've been a soldier in the United States Army. I served in combat in Vietnam until critically wounded. I hereby renounce further obligation in service or duty to the United States Army. My first obligation now lies with the Indian people, fighting for the lawful treaty to fish in usual and accustomed water of the Nisqually, Columbia, and other rivers of the Pacific Northwest, and in serving them in this fight in any way possible. My decision is influenced by the fact that we have already buried Indian fishermen returned dead from Vietnam, while Indian fishermen live here without protection and under steady attack. Just 3 years ago today, on October 13th, 1965, 19 women and children were brutalized by more than 45 armed agents of the state of Washington at Frank's Landing on the Nisqually River in a vicious, unwarranted attack. Interestingly, the oldest human skeletal remains ever found in the Western Hemisphere were recently uncovered on the banks of the Columbia River, the remains of Indian fishermen. What kind of government or society would spend millions of dollars to pick upon our bones, restore our ancestral life patterns, and protect our ancient remains from damage, while at the same time eating upon the flesh of our living people? We will fight for our rights. Indians fought back not only with physical resistance, but also with the artifacts of white culture, books, words, newspapers. In 1968, members of the Mohawk Nation at Akwesasne on the St. Lawrence River between the United States and Canada began a remarkable newspaper, Akwesasne Notes, with news, editorials, poetry, all flaming with the spirit of defiance. Mixed in with all that was an irrepressible humor. Vine Deloria Jr. wrote, "Every now and then I am impressed with the thinking of the non-Indian. I was in Cleveland last year and got to talking with a non-Indian about American history. He said that he was really sorry about what had happened to Indians, but that there was a good reason for it. The continent had to be developed, and he felt that Indians had stood in the way, and thus it had to be removed. After all, he remarked, what did you do with the land when you had it?" I didn't understand him until later, when I discovered that the Cuyahoga River, running through Cleveland, is inflammable. So many combustible pollutants are dumped into the river that the inhabitants have to take special precautions during the summer to avoid setting it on fire. After reviewing the argument of my non-Indian friend, I decided that he was probably correct. Whites had made better use of the land. How many Indians could have thought of creating an inflammable river? In 1969, November 9th, there took place a dramatic event which focused attention on Indian grievances as nothing else had. It burst through the invisibility of previous local Indian protests and declared to the entire world that the Indians still lived and would fight for their rights. On that day before dawn, 78 Indians landed on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay and occupied the island. Alcatraz was an abandoned federal prison, a hated and terrible place, nicknamed the Rock. In 1964, some young Indians had occupied it to establish an Indian university, but they were driven off and there was no publicity. This time it was different. The group was led by Richard Oakes, a Mohawk, who directed Indian studies at San Francisco State College, and Grace Thorpe, a Sac and Fox Indian, daughter of Jim Thorpe, the famous Indian college football star and Olympic runner, jumper, hurdler. More Indians landed, and by the end of November, nearly 600 of them, representing more than 50 tribes, were living on Alcatraz. They called themselves Indians of all tribes and issued a proclamation. "We hold the Rock." In it, they offered to buy Alcatraz in glass beads and red cloth, the price paid Indians for Manhattan Island over 300 years earlier. They said, "We feel that this so-called Alcatraz Island is more suitable for an Indian reservation, as determined by the white man's own standards. By this we mean that this place resembles most Indian reservations in that, 1. It is isolated from modern facilities and without adequate means of transportation. 2. It has no fresh running water. 3. It has inadequate sanitation facilities. 4. There are no oil or mineral rights. 5. There is no industry, and so unemployment is very great. 6. There are no healthcare facilities. 7. The soil is rocky and non-productive, and the land does not support game. 8. There are no educational facilities. 9. The population has always exceeded the land base. 10. The population has always been held prisoners and dependent upon others." They announced they would make the island a center for Native American studies for ecology. "We will work to depollute the air and waters of the Bay Area, restore fish and animal life." In the months that followed, the government cut off telephones, electricity, and water to Alcatraz Island. Many of the Indians had to leave, but others insisted on staying. A year later, they were still there, and they sent out a message to our brothers and sisters of all races and tongues upon our Earth Mother. We are still holding the island of Alcatraz in the true names of freedom, justice, and equality, because you, our brothers and sisters of this earth, have lent support to our just cause. We reach out our hands and hearts and send spirit messages to each and every one of you. We hold the rock. We have learned that violence breeds only more violence, and we therefore have carried on our occupation of Alcatraz in a peaceful manner, hoping that the government of these United States will also act accordingly. We are a proud people. We are Indians. We have observed and rejected much of what so-called civilization offers. We are Indians. We will preserve our traditions and ways of life by educating our own children. We are Indians. We will join hands in a unity never before put into practice. We are Indians. Our Earth Mother awaits our voices. We are Indians of all tribes. We hold the rock. 6 months later, federal forces invaded the island and physically removed the Indians living there. It had been thought that the Navajo Indians would not be heard from again. In the mid-1800s, United States troops under Kit Carson burned Navajo villages, destroyed their crops and orchards, forced them from their lands. But in the Black Mesa of New Mexico, they never surrendered. In the late 1960s, the Peabody Coal Company began strip mining on their land, a ruthless excavation of the topsoil. The company pointed to a contract signed with some Navajos. It was reminiscent of the treaty signed with some Indians in the past that took away all Indian land. 150 Navajos met in the spring of 1969 to declare that the strip mining would pollute the water and the air, destroy the grazing land for livestock, use up their scarce water resources. A young woman pointed to a public relations pamphlet put out by the Peabody Coal Company, showing fishing lakes, grassland, trees, and said, "We're not going to have anything like those you see in the pictures. What is the future going to be like for our children, our children's children?" An elderly Navajo woman, one of the organizers of the meeting, said, "Peabody's monsters are digging up the heart of our Mother Earth, our sacred mountain, and we also feel the pains. I have lived here for years, and I'm not about to move." The Hopi Indians were also affected by the Peabody operations. They wrote to President Nixon in protest. Today, the sacred lands where the Hopi live are being desecrated by men who seek coal and water from our soil, that they may create more power for the white man's cities. The Great Spirit said not to allow this to happen. The Great Spirit said not to take from the earth, not to destroy living things. It is said by the Great Spirit that if a gourd of ashes is dropped upon the earth, that many men will die and that the end of this way of life is near at hand. We interpret this as the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We do not want to see this happen to any place or any nation again. But instead, we should turn all this energy for peaceful uses, not for war. In the fall of 1970, a magazine called La Raza, one of the countless local publications coming out of the movements of those years to supply information ignored in the regular media, told about the Pitt River Indians of Northern California. 60 Pitt Indians occupied land they said belonged to them. They defied the Forest Services when ordered to leave. One of them, Darrell B. Wilson, later recalled, "As the flames danced orange, making the trees come to life, and the cold creeped out of the darkness to challenge the speaking fire, and our breath came in small clouds, we spoke." They asked the government by what treaty it claimed the land. It could point to none. They cited a federal statute, 25 U.S.C.A. 194, that where there was a land dispute between Indian and white, the burden of proof falls on the white man. They had built a Quonset hut, and the marshals told them it was ugly and ruined the landscape. Wilson wrote later, "The whole world is rotting. The water is poisoned, the air polluted, the politics deformed, the land gutted, the forest pillaged, the shores ruined, the towns burned, the lives of the people destroyed. And the Federals spent the best part of October trying to tell us the Quonset hut was ugly. To us it was beautiful. It was the beginning of our school, the meeting place, home for our homeless, a sanctuary for those needing rest, our church, our headquarters, our business office, our symbol of approaching freedom, and it still stands. It was also the center for the reviving of our stricken, diluted, and separated culture, our beginning. It was our sun rising on a clear spring day when the sky holds no clouds. It was a good and pure thing for the heart to look upon. That small place on earth, our place. But 150 marshals came with machine guns, shotguns, rifles, pistols, riot sticks, mace, dogs, chains, manacles. The old people were frightened. The young questioned bravery. The small children were like a deer that has been shot by the thunderstick. Hearts beat fast as though a race was just run in the heat of summer. The marshals began swinging their riot sticks and blood started flowing. Wilson grabbed one marshal's club, was thrown down, manacled, and while lying face down on the ground was struck behind the head several times. A 60-year-old man was beaten into unconsciousness. A white reporter was arrested, his wife beaten. They were all thrown into trucks and taken away, charged with assaulting state and federal officers and cutting trees, but not with trespassing, which might have brought into question the ownership of the land. When the episode was all over, they were still defiant. Indians who had been in the Vietnam War made connections. At the Winter Soldier Investigations in Detroit, where Vietnam veterans testified about their experiences, an Oklahoma Indian named Evan Haney told about this. The same massacres happened to the Indians 100 years ago. Germ warfare was used then. They put smallpox in the Indians' blankets. I got to know the Vietnamese people, and I learned they were just like us. What we are doing is destroying ourselves and the world. I have grown up with racism all my life. When I was a child, watching cowboys and Indians on TV, I would root for the cavalry, not the Indians. It was that bad. I was that far toward my own destruction. Though 50% of the children at the country school I attended in Oklahoma were Indians, nothing in school, on television, or on the radio taught anything about Indian culture. There were no books on Indian history, not even in the library. But I knew something was wrong. I started reading and learning my own culture. I saw the Indian people at their happiest when they went to Alcatraz or to Washington to defend their fishing rights. They at last felt like human beings. Indians began to do something about their own destruction, the annihilation of their culture. In 1969, at the first convocation of American Indian scholars, Indians spoke indignantly of either the ignoring or the insulting of Indians in textbooks given to little children all over the United States. That year, the Indian Historian Press was founded. It evaluated 400 textbooks in elementary and secondary schools and found that not one of them gave an accurate depiction of the Indian. A counterattack began in the schools. In early 1971, 45 Indian students at Copper Valley School in Glen Allen, Alaska, wrote a letter to their congressman opposing the Alaska oil pipeline as ruinous to the ecology, a threat to the peace, quiet, and security of our Alaska. Other Americans were beginning to pay attention, to rethink their own learning. The first motion pictures attempting to redress the history of the Indian appeared. One was Little Big Man, based on a novel by Thomas Berger. More and more books appeared on Indian history, until a whole new literature came into existence. Teachers became sensitive to the old stereotypes, threw away the old textbooks, started using new material. In the spring of 1977, a teacher named Jane Califf in the New York City elementary schools told of her experiences with 4th and 5th grade students. She brought into class the traditional textbooks and asked the students to locate the stereotypes in them. She read aloud from Native American writers and articles from Akwesasne Notes, and put protest posters around the room. The children then wrote letters to the editors of the books they had read. Dear editor, I don't like your book called The Cruise of Christopher Columbus. I didn't like it because you said some things about Indians that weren't true. Another thing I didn't like was on page 69. It says that Christopher Columbus invited the Indians to Spain, but what really happened was that he stole them. Sincerely, Raymond Miranda. On Thanksgiving Day, 1970, at the annual celebration of the landing of the Pilgrims, the authorities decided to do something different, invite an Indian to make the celebratory speech. They found a Wampanoag Indian named Frank James and asked him to speak. But when they saw the speech he was about to deliver, they decided they did not want it. His speech, not heard at Plymouth, Massachusetts on that occasion, said in part, the whole speech is in Chronicles of American Indian Protest. I speak to you as a man, a Wampanoag man. It is with mixed emotions that I stand here to share my thoughts. The Pilgrims had hardly explored the shores of Cape Cod 4 days before they had robbed the graves of my ancestors and stolen their corn, wheat, and beans. Our spirit refuses to die. Yesterday we walked the woodland paths and sandy trails. Today we must walk the macadam highways and roads. We are uniting. We are standing not in our wigwams, but in your concrete tent. We stand tall and proud, and before too many moons pass, we'll right the wrongs we have allowed to happen to us. For Indians, there has never been a clear line between prose and poetry. When an Indian studying in New Mexico was praised for his poetry, he said, "In my tribe, we have no poets. Everyone talks in poetry." There are, however, poems collected in William Brandon's The Last Americans and in The Way by Shirley Hill Witt and Stan Steiner. In Anishinaabe Spring Poem, translated by Gerald Weisenar, "As my eyes look across the prairie, I feel the summer in the spring." Snow the Last by Joseph Concha. Snow comes last, for it quiets down everything. This from a fifth-year group in a special Navajo program in the year 1940 called It Is Not. The Navajo Reservation a lonesome place? It is not. The skies are sunny, clear blue, or gray with rain. Each day is gay in nature's way. It is not a lonesome place at all. A Navajo house, shabby and small. It is not. Inside there's love, good laughter, and big talk. But best, it's home, with an open door and room for all. A castle could have no more. In March of 1973 came a powerful affirmation that the Indians of North America were still alive. On the site of the 1890 massacre on Pine Ridge Reservation, several hundred Oglala Sioux and friends returned to the village of Wounded Knee to occupy it as a symbol of the demand for Indian land, Indian rights. The history of that event, in the words of the participants, has been captured in a rare book published by Akwesasne Notes, Voices from Wounded Knee, 1973. In the 1970s, 54% of the adult males on the Pine Ridge Reservation were unemployed. 1/3 of the families were on welfare or pensions. Alcoholism was widespread and suicide rates were high. The life expectancy of an Oglala Sioux was 46 years. Just before the Wounded Knee occupation, there was violence at the town of Custer. An Indian named Wesley Badheart Bull was killed by a white gas station attendant. The man was let out on a $5,000 bond and indicted for manslaughter, facing a possible 10-year term. A gathering of Indians to protest this led to a clash with police. The murder victim's mother, Mrs. Sarah Badheart Bull, was arrested on charges that called for a maximum sentence of 30 years. On February 27, 1973, about 300 Oglala Sioux, many of them members of the new militant organization called the American Indian Movement, AIM, entered the village of Wounded Knee and declared it liberated territory. Ellen Move's camp later said, "We decided that we did need the American Indian Movement in here because our men were scared. They hung to the back. It was mostly the women that went forward and spoke out." Within hours, more than 200 FBI agents, federal marshals, and police of the Bureau of Indian Affairs surrounded and blockaded the town. They had armored vehicles, automatic rifles, machine guns, grenade launchers, and gas shells, and soon began firing. Gladys Bissonnette said 3 weeks later, "Since we are here in Wounded Knee, we've been shot at over and over, always after dark. But last night we were hit the hardest. I guess the Great Spirit is with us, and no bullets find their way into our bodies. We ran through a hail of bullets one night. We're going to hold our stand until we are completely an independent sovereign nation, Oglala Sioux Nation." After the siege began, food supplies became short. Indians in Michigan sent food via a plane that landed inside the encampment. The next day, FBI agents arrested the pilot and a doctor from Michigan who had hired the plane. In Nevada, 11 Indians were arrested for taking food, clothing, and medical supplies to South Dakota. In mid-April, 3 more planes dropped 1,200 pounds of food. But as people scrambled to gather it up, a government helicopter appeared overhead and fired down on them while ground fire came from all sides. Frank Clearwater, an Indian man lying on a cot inside a church, was hit by a bullet. When his wife accompanied him to a hospital, she was arrested and jailed. Clearwater died. There were more gun battles, another death. Finally, a negotiated peace was signed in which both sides agreed to disarm. The Indians had refused to disarm while surrounded by armed men, recalling the 1890 massacre. The United States government promised to investigate Indian affairs, and a presidential commission would re-examine the 1868 treaty. The siege ended, and 120 occupiers were arrested. The U.S. government then said that it had re-examined the 1868 treaty, found it valid, but that it was superseded by the U.S. power of eminent domain, the government's power to take land. The Indians had held out for 71 days, creating a marvelous community inside the besieged territory. Communal kitchens were set up, a health clinic and hospital, a Navajo Vietnam veteran. There's a tremendous amount of coolness considering that we're outgunned, but people stay because they believe they have a cause. That's why we lost in Vietnam, because there was no cause. We were fighting a rich man's war for the rich man. In Wounded Knee, we're doing pretty damn good morale-wise, because we can still laugh. Messages of support came to Wounded Knee from Australia, Finland, Germany, Italy, Japan, England. One message came from some of the Attica brothers, 2 of whom were Indians. You fight for our Earth Mother and her children. Our spirits fight with you. Wallace Black Elk replied, Little Wounded Knee is turned into a giant world. After Wounded Knee, in spite of the deaths, the trials, the use of the police and courts to try to break the movement, the Native American movement continued. In the Akwesasne community itself, which put out Akwesasne Notes, the Indians had always insisted their territory was separate, not to be invaded by the white man's law. One day, New York State Police gave 3 traffic tickets to a Mohawk Indian truck driver, and a council of Indians met with a police lieutenant. At first, he insisted that he had to follow orders and give out tickets, even in Akwesasne territory, although he obviously was trying to be reasonable. He finally agreed that they would not arrest an Indian in the territory, or even outside of it, without first having a meeting with the Mohawk Council. The lieutenant then sat down and lit a cigar. Indian Chief Joaquiso, a distinguished-looking man with long hair, rose and addressed the lieutenant with a serious voice. There is one more thing before you go, he said, looking straight at the lieutenant. I want to know, he said slowly, if you've got an extra cigar. The meeting ended in laughter. Akwesasne Notes continued to publish. On its poetry page, late autumn 1976, appear poems reflecting the spirit of the times. Isla Abernathy wrote, I am grass growing and the shearer of grass. I am the willow and the splitter of laths, weaver and the thing woven, marriage of willow and grass. I am frost on the land and the land's life, breath and beast and the sharp rock underfoot. In me the mountain lives and the owl strikes, and I in them. I am the sun's twin, mover of blood and the blood lost. I am the deer and the deer's death. I am the burr in your conscience. Acknowledge me. And Buffy St. Marie, you think I have visions because I'm an Indian. I have visions because there are visions to be seen. In the 60s and 70s, it was not just a women's movement, a prisoners' movement, an Indian movement. There was general revolt against oppressive, artificial, previously unquestioned ways of living. It touched every aspect of personal life, childbirth, childhood, love, sex, marriage, dress, music, art, sports, language, food, housing, religion, literature, death, schools. The new temper, the new behavior shocked many Americans. It created tensions. Sometimes it was seen as a generation gap, the younger generation moving far away from the older one in its way of life. But it seemed after a while to be not so much a matter of age. Some young people remained straight, while some middle-aged people were changing their ways, and old people were beginning to behave in ways that astounded others. Sexual behavior went through startling changes. Premarital sex was no longer a matter for silence. Men and women lived together outside of marriage and struggled for words to describe the other person when introduced. I want you to meet my friend. Married couples candidly spoke of their affairs, and books appeared discussing open marriage. Masturbation could be talked about openly, even approvingly. Homosexuality was no longer concealed. Gay men and gay women, lesbians, organized to combat discrimination against them, to give themselves a sense of community, to overcome shame and isolation. All this was reflected in the literature and in the mass media. Court decisions overruled the local banning of books that were erotic or even pornographic. A new literature appeared, The Joy of Sex and Others, to teach men and women how sexual fulfillment could be attained. The movies now did not hesitate to show nudity, although the motion picture industry, wanting to preserve principle as well as profit, set up a classification system, R for restricted, X for prohibited to children. The language of sex became more common both in literature and in ordinary conversation. All this was connected with new living arrangements. Especially among young people, communal living arrangements flourished. A few were truly communes, that is, based on the sharing of money and decisions, creating a community of intimacy, affection, trust. Most were practical arrangements for sharing the rent, with varying degrees of friendship and intimate association among the participants. It was no longer unusual for men and women to be roommates in groups of 2 or 3 or larger, and without sexual relations, as practical, unself-conscious arrangements. The most important thing about dress in the cultural change of the 60s was the greater informality. For women, it was a continuation of the historic feminist movement's insistence on discarding of feminine, hampering clothes. Many women stopped wearing bras. The restrictive girdle, almost a uniform of the 40s and 50s, became rare. Young men and women dressed more nearly alike, in jeans, in discarded army uniforms. Men stopped wearing neckties. Women of all ages wore pants more often, unspoken homage to Amelia Bloomer. There was a new popular music of protest. Pete Seeger had been singing protest songs since the 40s, but now he came into his own, his audiences much larger. Bob Dylan and Joan Baez singing not only protest songs, but songs reflecting the new abandon, the new culture, became popular idols. A middle-aged woman on the West Coast, Malvina Reynolds, wrote and sang songs that fit her socialist thinking and her libertarian spirit, as well as her critique of the modern commercial culture. Everybody now, she sang, lived in little boxes, and they all came out just the same. Bob Dylan was a phenomenon unto himself. Powerful songs of protest, personal songs of freedom and self-expression. In an angry song, Masters of War, he hopes that one day they will die and he will follow their casket in the pale afternoon. A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall recounts the terrible stories of the last decades, of starvation and war and tears and dead ponies and poisoned waters and damp, dirty prisons. It's a hard rain's gonna fall. Dylan sang a bitter anti-war song, With God on Our Side, and one about the killer of the black activist Medgar Evers, only a pawn in their game. He offered a challenge to the old, hope to the new, for the times they are a-changing. The Catholic upsurge against the war was part of a general revolt inside the Catholic Church, which had for so long been a bulwark of conservatism, tied to racism, jingoism, war. Priests and nuns resigned from the church, opened their lives to sex, got married and had children, sometimes without bothering to leave the church officially. True, there was still enormous popularity for the old-time religious revivalists, and Billy Graham commanded the obedience of millions. But now there were small, swift currents against the mainstream. There was a new suspicion of big business, of profiteering as the motive for ruining the environment. There was a re-examination of the death industry, of money-making funerals and profitable tombstones, as in Jessica Mitford's The American Way of Death. With the loss of faith in big powers, business, government, religion, there arose a stronger belief in self, whether individual or collective. The experts in all fields were now looked at skeptically. The belief grew that people could figure out for themselves what to eat, how to live their lives, how to be healthy. There was suspicion of the medical industry and campaigns against chemical preservatives, valueless foods, advertising. By now, the scientific evidence of the evils of smoking, cancer, heart disease, was so powerful that the government barred advertising of cigarettes on television and in newspapers. Traditional education began to be re-examined. The schools had taught whole generations the values of patriotism, of obeying authority, and had perpetuated ignorance, even contempt for people of other nations, races, Native Americans, women. Not just the content of education was challenged, but the style, the formality, the bureaucracy, the insistence on subordination to authority. This made only a small dent in the formidable national system of orthodox education, but it was reflected in a new generation of teachers all over the country, and a new literature to sustain them. Jonathan Kozol, Death at an Early Age, George Denison, The Lives of Children, Ivan Illich, Deschooling Society. Never in American history had more movements for change been concentrated in so short a span of years. But the system in the course of 2 centuries had learned a good deal about the control of people. In the mid-70s, it went to work. Chapter 20, the 70s, under control. In the early 70s, the system seemed out of control. It could not hold the loyalty of the public. As early as 1970, according to the University of Michigan Survey Research Center, trust in government was low in every section of the population, and there was a significant difference by class. Of professional people, 40% had low political trust in the government. Of unskilled blue-collar workers, 66% had low trust. Public opinion surveys in 1971, after 7 years of intervention in Vietnam, showed an unwillingness to come to the aid of other countries, assuming they were attacked by communist-backed forces. Even for countries allied to the United States in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or Mexico, right on our southern border, there was no majority opinion for intervening with American troops. As for Thailand, if it were under communist attack, only 12% of whites interrogated would send troops. 4% of non-whites would do so. In the summer of 1972, anti-war people in the Boston area were picketing Honeywell Corporation. The literature they distributed pointed out that Honeywell was producing anti-personnel weapons used in Vietnam, like the deadly cluster bomb that had riddled thousands of Vietnamese civilians with painful, hard-to-extricate pellets. About 600 ballots were given to the Honeywell employees, asking if they thought that Honeywell should discontinue making these weapons. Of the 231 persons who returned the ballots, 131 said that Honeywell should stop. 88 said it should not. They were invited to make comments. A typical no comment. Honeywell is not responsible for what the Department of Defense does with the goods it buys. A typical yes comment. How may we have pride in our work when the entire basis for this work is immoral? The Survey Research Center of the University of Michigan had been posing the question, is the government run by a few big interests looking out for themselves? The answer in 1964 had been yes, from 26% of those polled. By 1972, the answer was yes from 53% of those polled. An article in the American Political Science Review by Arthur H. Miller, reporting on the extensive polling done by Survey Research Center, said that the poll showed widespread basic discontent and political alienation. He added, political scientists often took on the worries of the establishment. What is startling and somewhat alarming is the rapid degree of change in this basic attitude over a period of only 6 years. More voters than ever before refused to identify themselves as either Democrats or Republicans. Back in 1940, 20% of those polled called themselves independents. In 1974, 34% called themselves independents. The courts, the juries, and even judges were not behaving as usual. Juries were acquitting radicals. Angela Davis, an acknowledged communist, was acquitted by an all-white jury on the West Coast. Black Panthers, whom the government had tried in every way to malign and destroy, were freed by juries in several trials. A judge in western Massachusetts threw out a case against a young activist, Sam Lovejoy, who had toppled a 500-foot tower erected by a utility company trying to set up a nuclear plant. In Washington, D.C., in August 1973, a Superior Court judge refused to sentence 6 men charged with unlawful entry who had stepped from a White House tour line to protest the bombing of Cambodia. Undoubtedly, much of this national mood of hostility to government and business came out of the Vietnam War, its 55,000 casualties, its moral shame, its exposure of government lies and atrocities. On top of this came the political disgrace of the Nixon administration and the scandals that came to be known by the one-word label Watergate, and which led to the historic resignation from the presidency, the first in American history, of Richard Nixon in August 1974. It began during the presidential campaign in June of 1972, when 5 burglars carrying wiretapping and photo equipment were caught in the act of breaking into the offices of the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate apartment complex of Washington, D.C. One of the 5, James McCord Jr., worked for the Nixon campaign. He was security officer for the Committee to Re-elect the President, CREEP. Another of the 5 had an address book in which was listed the name of E. Howard Hunt, and Hunt's address was listed at the White House. He was assistant to Charles Colson, who was special counsel to President Nixon. Both McCord and Hunt had worked for many years for the CIA. Hunt had been the CIA man in charge of the invasion of Cuba in 1961, and 3 of the Watergate burglars were veterans of the invasion. McCord, as CREEP security man, worked for the chief of CREEP, John Mitchell, the Attorney General of the United States. Thus, due to an unforeseen arrest by police, unaware of the high-level connections of the burglars, information was out to the public before anyone could stop it, linking the burglars to important officials in Nixon's campaign committee, to the CIA, and to Nixon's Attorney General. Mitchell denied any connection with the burglary, and Nixon, in a press conference 5 days after the event, said, "The White House has had no involvement whatever in this particular incident." What followed the next year, after a grand jury in September indicted the Watergate burglars, plus Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy, was that one after another, lesser officials of the Nixon administration, fearing prosecution, began to talk. They gave information in judicial proceedings to a Senate investigating committee, to the press. They implicated not only John Mitchell, but Robert Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, Nixon's highest White House aides, and finally, Richard Nixon himself, in not only the Watergate burglaries, but a whole series of illegal actions against political opponents and anti-war activists. Nixon and his aides lied again and again as they tried to cover up their involvement. These facts came out in the various testimonies. 1. Attorney General John Mitchell controlled a secret fund of $350,000 to $700,000 to be used against the Democratic Party for forging letters, leaking false news items to the press, stealing campaign files. 2. Gulf Oil Corporation, ITT, International Telephone and Telegraph, American Airlines, and other huge American corporations had made illegal contributions running into the millions of dollars to the Nixon campaign. 3. In September of 1971, shortly after the New York Times printed Daniel Ellsberg's copies of the top-secret Pentagon Papers, the administration planned and carried out, Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy themselves doing it, the burglary of the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist looking for Ellsberg's records. 4. After the Watergate burglars were caught, Nixon secretly pledged to give them executive clemency if they were imprisoned, and suggested that up to $1 million be given them to keep them quiet. In fact, $450,000 was given to them on Ehrlichman's orders. 5. Nixon's nominee for head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover had recently died, L. Patrick Gray, revealed that he had turned over the FBI records on its investigation of the Watergate burglary to Nixon's legal assistant, John Dean, and that Attorney General Richard Kleindienst, Mitchell had just resigned, saying he wanted to pursue his private life, had ordered him not to discuss Watergate with the Senate Judiciary Committee. 6. Two former members of Nixon's cabinet, John Mitchell and Maurice Stans, were charged with taking $250,000 from a financier named Robert Vesco in return for their help with a Securities and Exchange Commission investigation of Vesco's activities. 7. It turned out that certain material had disappeared from FBI files, material from a series of illegal wiretaps ordered by Henry Kissinger, placed on the telephones of 4 journalists and 13 government officials, and was in the White House safe of Nixon's advisor, John Ehrlichman. 8. One of the Watergate burglars, Bernard Barker, told the Senate committee that he had also been involved in a plan to physically attack Daniel Ellsberg while Ellsberg spoke at an anti-war rally in Washington. 9. A deputy director of the CIA testified that Haldeman and Ehrlichman told him it was Nixon's wish that the CIA tell the FBI not to pursue its investigation beyond the Watergate burglary. 10. Almost by accident, a witness told the Senate committee that President Nixon had tapes of all personal conversations and phone conversations at the White House. Nixon at first refused to turn over the tapes, and when he finally did, they had been tampered with. 18.5 minutes of one tape had been erased. 11. In the midst of all this, Nixon's Vice President Spiro Agnew was indicted in Maryland for receiving bribes from Maryland contractors in return for political favors and resigned from the vice presidency in October 1973. Nixon appointed Congressman Gerald Ford to take Agnew's place. 12. Over $10 million in government money had been used by Nixon on his private homes in San Clemente and Key Biscayne on grounds of security, and he had illegally taken, with the aid of a bit of forgery, a $576,000 tax deduction for some of his papers. 13. It was disclosed that for over a year in 1969 to 1970, the U.S. had engaged in a secret, massive bombing of Cambodia, which it kept from the American people and even from Congress. It was a swift and sudden fall. In the November 1972 presidential election, Nixon and Agnew had won 60% of the popular vote and carried every state except Massachusetts, defeating an anti-war candidate, Senator George McGovern. By June of 1973, a Gallup poll showed 67% of those polled thought Nixon was involved in the Watergate break-in or lied to cover up. By the fall of 1973, 8 different resolutions had been introduced in the House of Representatives for the impeachment of President Nixon. The following year, a House committee drew up a bill of impeachment to present to a full House. Nixon's advisors told him it would pass the House by the required majority, and then the Senate would vote the necessary 2/3 majority to remove him from office. On August 8, 1974, Nixon resigned. 6 months before Nixon resigned, the business magazine Dunn's Review reported a poll of 300 corporation executives. Almost all had voted for Nixon in 1972, but now a majority said he should resign. Right now, 90% of Wall Street would cheer if Nixon resigns, said a vice president of Merrill Lynch Government Securities. When he did, there was a relief in all sectors of the establishment. Gerald Ford, taking Nixon's office, said, "Our long national nightmare is over." Newspapers, whether they had been for or against Nixon, liberal or conservative, celebrated the successful, peaceful culmination of the Watergate crisis. "The system is working," said a longtime strong critic of the Vietnam War, New York Times columnist Anthony Lewis. The 2 journalists who had much to do with investigating and exposing Nixon, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward of the Washington Post, wrote that with Nixon's departure, there might be restoration. All of this was in a mood of relief, of gratitude. No respectable American newspaper said what was said by Claude Julien, editor of Le Monde Diplomatique in September 1974. The elimination of Mr. Richard Nixon leaves intact all the mechanisms and all the false values which permitted the Watergate scandal. Julian noted that Nixon's Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, would remain at his post. In other words, that Nixon's foreign policy would continue. That is to say, Julian wrote, that Washington will continue to support General Pinochet in Chile, General Giselle in Brazil, General Stroessner in Paraguay, etc. Months after Julian wrote this, it was disclosed that top Democratic and Republican leaders in the House of Representatives had given secret assurance to Nixon that if he resigned, they would not support criminal proceedings against him. One of them, the ranking Republican of the Judiciary Committee, said, "We had all been shuddering about what 2 weeks of televised floor debates on impeachment would do, how it would tear the country apart and affect foreign policy." The New York Times articles that reported on Wall Street's hope for Nixon's resignation quoted one Wall Street financier as saying that if Nixon resigned, what we will have is the same play with different players. When Gerald Ford, a conservative Republican who had supported all of Nixon's policies, was nominated for president, a liberal senator from California, Alan Cranston, spoke for him on the floor, saying he had polled many people, Republicans and Democrats, and found an almost startling consensus of conciliation that is developing around him. When Nixon resigned and Ford became president, the New York Times said, "Out of the despair of Watergate has come an inspiring new demonstration of the uniqueness and strength of the American democracy." A few days later, the Times wrote happily that the peaceful transfer of power brought a cleansing sense of relief to the American people. In the charges brought by the House Committee on Impeachment against Nixon, it seemed clear that the committee did not want to emphasize those elements in his behavior which were found in other presidents and which might be repeated in the future. It stayed clear of Nixon's dealings with powerful corporations. It did not mention the bombing of Cambodia. It concentrated on things peculiar to Nixon, not on fundamental policies continuous among American presidents at home and abroad. The word was out: get rid of Nixon, but keep the system. Theodore Sorensen, who had been an advisor to President Kennedy, wrote at the time of Watergate, "The underlying causes of the gross misconduct in our law enforcement system, now being revealed, are largely personal, not institutional. Some structural changes are needed. All the rotten apples should be thrown out, but save the barrel." Indeed, the barrel was saved. Nixon's foreign policy remained. The government's connections to corporate interests remained. Ford's closest friends in Washington were corporate lobbyists. Alexander Haig, who had been one of Nixon's closest advisors, who had helped in processing the tapes before turning them over to the public, and who gave the public misinformation about the tapes, was appointed by President Ford to be head of the armed forces of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. One of Ford's first acts was to pardon Nixon, thus saving him from possible criminal proceedings and allowing him to retire with a huge pension in California. The establishment had cleansed itself of members of the club who had broken the rules, but it took some pains not to treat them too harshly. Those few who received jail sentences got short terms, were sent to the most easygoing federal institutions available, and were given special privileges not given to ordinary prisoners. Richard Kleindienst pleaded guilty. He got a $100 fine and 1 month in jail, which was suspended. That Nixon would go, but that the power of the president to do anything he wanted in the name of national security would stay. This was underscored by a Supreme Court decision in July 1974. The court said Nixon had to turn over his White House tapes to the special Watergate prosecutor, but at the same time it affirmed the confidentiality of presidential communications, which it could not uphold in Nixon's case, but which remained as a general principle when the president made a claim of need to protect military, diplomatic, or sensitive national security secrets. The televised Senate committee hearings on Watergate stopped suddenly before the subject of corporate connections was reached. It was typical of the selective coverage of important events by the television industry. Bizarre shenanigans like the Watergate burglary were given full treatment, while instances of ongoing practice, the My Lai massacre, the secret bombing of Cambodia, the work of the FBI and CIA, were given the most fleeting attention. Dirty tricks against the Socialist Workers' Party, the Black Panthers, other radical groups, had to be searched for in a few newspapers. The whole nation heard the details of the quick break-in at the Watergate apartment. There was never a similar television hearing on the long-term break-in in Vietnam. In the trial of John Mitchell and Maurice Stans for obstruction of justice in impeding a Securities and Exchange Commission investigation of Robert Vesco, a contributor to Nixon, George Bradford Cook, former general counsel of the SEC, testified that on November 13, 1972, he crouched in a Texas rice field while on a goose hunt with Maurice Stans and told him he wanted to be chairman of the SEC. For this, he would cut out a critical paragraph in the SEC charges against Vesco that referred to Vesco's $200,000 secret contribution to the Nixon campaign. Corporate influence on the White House is a permanent fact of the American system. Most of it is wise enough to stay within the law. Under Nixon, they took chances. An executive in the meatpacking industry said during the Watergate events that he had been approached by a Nixon campaign official and told that while a $25,000 contribution would be appreciated, for $50,000 you get to talk to the president. Many of these corporations gave money to both sides, so that whichever won, they would have friends in the administration. Chrysler Corporation urged its executives to support the party and candidate of their choice, and then collected the checks from them and delivered the checks to Republican or Democratic campaign committees. International Telephone and Telegraph was an old hand at giving money on both sides. In 1960, it had made illegal contributions to Bobby Baker, who worked with Democratic senators, including Lyndon Johnson. A senior vice president of ITT was quoted by one of his assistants as saying, "The board of directors have it set up to butter both sides, so we'll be in a good position whoever wins." And in 1970, an ITT director, John McCone, who also had been head of the CIA, told Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State, and Richard Helms, CIA director, that ITT was willing to give $1 million to help the U.S. government in its plans to overthrow the Allende government in Chile. In 1971, ITT planned to take over the $1.5 billion Hartford Fire Insurance Company, the largest merger in corporate history. The Antitrust Division of the Justice Department moved to prosecute ITT for violating the antitrust laws. However, the prosecution did not take place, and ITT was allowed to merge with Hartford. It was all settled out of court in a secret arrangement in which ITT agreed to donate $400,000 to the Republican Party. It seemed that Richard Kleindienst, Deputy Attorney General, had 6 meetings with an ITT director named Felix Rohatyn, and then brought in the head of the Antitrust Division, Richard McLaren, who was persuaded by Rohatyn that to stop the merger would cause a hardship for ITT stockholders. McLaren agreed. He was later appointed a federal judge. One of the items not mentioned in the impeachment charges and never televised in the Senate hearings was the way the government cooperated with the milk industry. In early 1971, the Secretary of Agriculture announced the government would not increase its price supports for milk, the regular subsidy to the big milk producers. Then, the Associated Milk Producers began giving money to the Nixon campaign, met in the White House with Nixon and Secretary of Agriculture, gave more money, and the Secretary announced that new analysis made it necessary to raise milk price supports from $4.66 to $4.93 a hundredweight. More contributions were made, until the total exceeded $400,000. The price increases added $500 million to the profits of dairy farmers, mostly big corporations, at the expense of consumers. Whether Nixon or Ford or any Republican or Democrat was president, the system would work pretty much the same way. A Senate subcommittee investigating multinational corporations revealed a document, given passing mention in a few newspapers, in which oil company economists discussed holding back production of oil to keep prices up. Aramco, the Arabian American Oil Corporation, 75% of whose stock was held by American oil companies and 25% by Saudi Arabia, had made $1 profit on a barrel of oil in 1973. In 1974, it was making $4.50. None of this would be affected by who was president. Even in the most diligent of investigations in the Watergate affair, that of Archibald Cox, a special prosecutor later fired by Nixon, the corporations got off easy. American Airlines, which admitted making illegal contributions to the Nixon campaign, was fined $5,000. Goodyear was fined $5,000. 3M Corporation was fined $3,000. A Goodyear official was fined $1,000. A 3M official was fined $500. The New York Times, on October 20th, 1973, reported, Mr. Cox charged them only with the misdemeanor of making illegal contributions. The misdemeanor under the law involved non-willful contributions. The felony count involving willful contributions is punishable by a fine of $10,000 and/or a 2-year jail term. The misdemeanor by a $1,000 fine and/or a 1-year jail term. Asked at the courthouse here how the two executives who had admitted making the payments could be charged with making non-willing contributions, Mr. McBride, Cox's staff, replied, "That's a legal question which frankly baffles me as well." With Gerald Ford in office, the long continuity in American policy was maintained. He continued Nixon's policy of aid to the Saigon regime, apparently still hoping that the two government would remain stable. The head of a congressional committee, John Calkins, visiting South Vietnam just around the time of Nixon's fall from office, reported, "The South Vietnamese army shows every sign of being an effective and spirited security force. Oil exploration will begin very soon. Tourism can be encouraged by continued security of scenic and historic areas and by the erection of a new Hyatt Hotel. South Vietnam needs foreign investment to finance these and other developments. She has a large labor pool of talented, industrious people whose cost of labor is far less than Hong Kong, Singapore, or even Korea or Taiwan. I also feel there is much profit to be made there. The combination of serving both God and Mammon had proved attractive to Americans and others in the past. Vietnam can be the next take-off capitalist showplace in Asia." In the spring of 1975, everything that radical critics of American policy in Vietnam had been saying, that without American troops, the Saigon government's lack of popular support would be revealed, came true. An offensive by North Vietnamese troops left in the South by terms of the 1973 truce swept through town after town. Ford continued to be optimistic. He was the last of a long line of government officials and journalists who promised victory. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, February 19, 1963. "Victory is in sight." General William Westmoreland, November 15, 1967. "I have never been more encouraged in my 4 years in Vietnam." Columnist Joseph Alsop, November 1st, 1972. "Hanoi has accepted near total defeat." On April 16, 1975, Ford said, "I am absolutely convinced if Congress made available $722 million in military assistance by the time I asked, or sometime shortly thereafter, the South Vietnamese could stabilize the military situation in Vietnam today." 2 weeks later, April 29, 1975, the North Vietnamese moved into Saigon, and the war was over. Most of the establishment had already, despite Ford and a few stalwarts, given up on Vietnam. What they worried about was the readiness of the American public now to support other military actions overseas. There were trouble signs in the months before the defeat in Vietnam. In early 1975, Senator John C. Culver of Iowa was unhappy that Americans would not fight for Korea. He said that Vietnam had taken a mighty toll on the national will of the American people. Shortly before that, Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger, speaking to the Georgetown Center for Strategic and International Studies, was reported as being generally gloomy, saying that the world no longer regarded American military power as awesome. In March 1975, a Catholic organization making a survey of American attitudes on abortion learned other things. To the statement, "The people running this country, government, political, church, and civic leaders, don't tell us the truth," more than 83% agreed. New York Times international correspondent C.L. Sulzberger, a consistent supporter of government Cold War foreign policy, wrote in a troubled mood in early 1975 from Ankara, Turkey, that the glow has worn off from the era of the Truman Doctrine, when military aid was given to Greece and Turkey. He added, "And one cannot say that the bleak outlook here is balanced by any brilliant United States successes in Greece, where a vast mob recently battered the United States Embassy." He concluded, "There must be something seriously wrong with the way we present ourselves these days." The problem, according to Sulzberger, was not the United States behavior, but the way this behavior was presented to the world. It was a few months after these reports, in April of 1975, that Secretary of State Kissinger, invited to be commencement speaker at the University of Michigan, was faced with petitions protesting the invitation because of Kissinger's role in the Vietnam War. Also, a counter-commencement program was planned. He withdrew. It was a low time for the administration. Vietnam was lost. The very word supposed it was ours to lose. Kissinger was quoted that April by Washington Post columnist Tom Braden. "The U.S. must carry out some act somewhere in the world which shows its determination to continue to be a world power." The following month came the Mayaguez affair. The Mayaguez was an American cargo ship sailing from South Vietnam to Thailand in mid-May 1975, just 3 weeks after the victory of the revolutionary forces in Vietnam. When it came close to an island in Cambodia, where a revolutionary regime had just taken power, the ship was stopped by the Cambodians, taken to a port at a nearby island, and the crew removed to the mainland. The crew later described their treatment as courteous. "A man who spoke English greeted us with a handshake and welcomed us to Cambodia." The press reported, "Captain Miller and his men all say they were never abused by their captors. There were even accounts of kind treatment, of Cambodian soldiers feeding them first and eating what the Americans left, of the soldiers giving the seamen the mattresses off their beds." But the Cambodians did ask the crew about spying and the CIA. President Ford sent a message to the Cambodian government to release the ship and crew, and when 36 hours had elapsed and there was no response, the message had been given to the Chinese liaison mission in Washington, but was returned the next day, ostensibly undelivered, one press account said. He began military operations. U.S. planes bombed Cambodian ships. They strafed the very boat that was taking the American sailors to the mainland. The men had been detained on a Monday morning. On Wednesday evening, the Cambodians released them, putting them on a fishing boat headed for the American fleet. That afternoon, knowing the seamen had been taken off Tang Island, Ford nevertheless ordered a marine assault on Tang Island. That assault began about 7:15 Wednesday evening, but an hour earlier the crewmen were already headed back to the American fleet. About 7 o'clock p.m., the release had been announced on the radio in Bangkok. Indeed, the boat carrying the returned crewmen was spotted by a U.S. reconnaissance plane that signaled them. Not mentioned in any press account at the time or in any government statement was a fact that emerged in October 1976, when the General Accounting Office made a report on the Mayaguez affair. The U.S. had received a message from a Chinese diplomat saying China was using its influence with Cambodia on the ship and expected it to be released soon. This message was received 14 hours before the marine assault began. No American soldier was hurt by the Cambodians. The Marines invading Tang Island, however, met unexpectedly tough resistance, and of 200 invaders, 1/3 were soon dead or wounded. This exceeded the casualty rate in the World War II invasion of Iwo Jima. 5 of 11 helicopters in the invasion force were blown up or disabled. Also, 23 Americans were killed in a helicopter crash over Thailand on their way to participate in the action, a fact the government tried to keep secret. Altogether, 41 Americans were killed in the military actions ordered by Ford. There were 39 sailors on the Mayaguez. Why the rush to bomb, strafe, attack? Why, even after the ship and crew were recovered, did Ford order American planes to bomb the Cambodian mainland with untold Cambodian casualties? What could justify such a combination of moral blindness and military bungling? The answer to this came soon. It was necessary to show the world that giant America, defeated by tiny Vietnam, was still powerful and resolute. The New York Times reported on May 16, 1975. Administration officials, including Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger, were said to have been eager to find some dramatic means of underscoring President Ford's stated intention to maintain our leadership on a worldwide basis. The occasion came with the capture of the vessel. Administration officials made it clear that they welcomed the opportunity. Another press dispatch from Washington in the midst of the Mayaguez event said, high-ranking sources familiar with military strategy and planning said privately that the seizure of the vessel might provide the test of American determination in Southeast Asia that, they asserted, the U.S. had been seeking since the collapse of Allied governments in South Vietnam and Cambodia. Columnist James Reston wrote, in fact, the administration almost seems grateful for the opportunity to demonstrate that the president can act quickly. Officials here have been bridling over a host of silly taunts about the American paper tiger, and hope the Marines have answered the charge. It was not surprising that Secretary of Defense Schlesinger called it a very successful operation, done for purposes that were necessary for the well-being of this society. But why would the prestigious Times columnist James Reston, a strong critic of Nixon and Watergate, call the Mayaguez operation melodramatic and successful? And why would the New York Times, which had criticized the Vietnam War, talk about the admirable efficiency of the operation? What seemed to be happening was that the establishment, Republicans, Democrats, newspapers, television, was closing ranks behind Ford and Kissinger, and behind the idea that American authority must be asserted everywhere in the world. Congress at this time behaved much as it had done in the early years of the Vietnam War, like a flock of sheep. Back in 1973, in a mood of fatigue and disgust with the Vietnam War, Congress had passed a War Powers Act that required the president, before taking military action, to consult with Congress. In the Mayaguez affair, Ford ignored this. He had several aides make phone calls to 18 congressmen to inform them that military action was underway. But as I.F. Stone said, he was the maverick journalist who published the anti-establishment I.F. Stone's Weekly, Congress raped as easily as it did in the Tonkin Gulf affair. Congressman Robert Drinan of Massachusetts was an exception. Senator McGovern, Nixon's presidential opponent in 1976 and longtime anti-war critic, opposed the action. So did Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin. Senator Edward Brooke raised questions. Senator Edward Kennedy did not speak out, nor did other senators who, during the Vietnam War, had influenced Congress to ban further military action in Indochina, but now said their own legislation did not apply. Secretary of State Kissinger would say, "We are forced into this." When Kissinger was asked why the U.S. was risking the lives of the Mayaguez seamen by firing on ships in the area without knowing where they were, he called it a necessary risk. Kissinger also said the incident ought to make clear that there are limits beyond which the United States cannot be pushed, that the United States is prepared to defend those interests, and that it can get public support and congressional support for these actions. Indeed, congressmen, Democrats as well as Republicans, who had been critical of the Vietnam War, now seemed anxious to pull things together in a unified show of strength to the rest of the world. A week before the Mayaguez affair, 2 weeks before Saigon fell, 56 congressmen had signed a statement saying, "Let no nation read the events in Indochina as the failure of the American will." One of them was a black congressman from Georgia, Andrew Young. It was a complex process of consolidation that the system undertook in 1975. It included old-type military actions like the Mayaguez affair to assert authority in the world and at home. There was also a need to satisfy a disillusioned public that the system was criticizing and correcting itself. The standard way was to conduct publicized investigations that found specific culprits but left the system intact. Watergate had made both the FBI and the CIA look bad, breaking the laws they were sworn to uphold, cooperating with Nixon in his burglary jobs and illegal wiretapping. In 1975, congressional committees in the House and Senate began investigations of the FBI and CIA. The CIA inquiry disclosed that the CIA had gone beyond its original mission of gathering intelligence and was conducting secret operations of all kinds. For instance, back in the 1950s, it had administered the drug LSD to unsuspecting Americans to test its effects. One American scientist, given such a dose by a CIA agent, leaped from a New York hotel window to his death. The CIA had also been involved in assassination plots against Castro of Cuba and other heads of state. It had introduced African swine fever virus into Cuba in 1971, bringing disease and then slaughter to 500,000 pigs. A CIA operative told a reporter he delivered the virus from an army base in the Canal Zone to anti-Castro Cubans. It was also learned from the investigation that the CIA, with the collusion of a secret committee of 40 headed by Henry Kissinger, had worked to destabilize the Chilean government headed by Salvador Allende, a Marxist who had been elected president in one of the rare free elections in Latin America. ITT, with large interests in Cuba, played a part in this operation. When in 1974, the American ambassador to Chile, David Popper, suggested to the Chilean junta, which with US aid had overthrown Allende, that they were violating human rights, he was rebuked by Kissinger, who sent word, "Tell Popper to cut out the political science lectures." The investigation of the FBI disclosed many years of illegal actions to disrupt and destroy radical groups and left-wing groups of all kinds. The FBI had sent forged letters, engaged in burglaries, it admitted to 92 between 1960 and 1966, opened mail illegally, and, in the case of Black Panther leader Fred Hampton, seems to have conspired in murder. Valuable information came out of the investigations, but it was just enough and in just the right way. Moderate press coverage, little television coverage, thick books of reports with limited readership, to give the impression of an honest society correcting itself. The investigations themselves revealed the limits of government willingness to probe into such activities. The Church Committee, set up by the Senate, conducted its investigations with the cooperation of the agencies being investigated, and indeed submitted its findings on the CIA to the CIA to see if there was material that the agency wanted omitted. Thus, while there was much valuable material in the report, there is no way of knowing how much more there was. The final report was a compromise between committee diligence and CIA caution. The Pike Committee, set up in the House of Representatives, made no such agreement with the CIA or FBI, and when it issued its final report, the same House that had authorized its investigation voted to keep the report secret. When the report was leaked via a CBS newscaster, Daniel Shore, to the Village Voice in New York, it was never printed by the important newspapers in the country, the Times, the Washington Post, or others. Shore was suspended by CBS. It was another instance of cooperation between the mass media and the government in instances of national security. The Church Committee, in its report of CIA attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro and other foreign leaders, revealed an interesting point of view. The committee seemed to look on the killing of the head of state as an unpardonable violation of some gentleman's agreement among statesmen, much more deplorable than military interventions that killed ordinary people. The committee wrote in the introduction to its assassination report, "Once methods of coercion and violence are chosen, the probability of loss of life is always present. There is, however, a significant difference between a cold-blooded, targeted, intentional killing of an individual foreign leader and other forms of intervening in the affairs of foreign nations." The Church Committee uncovered CIA operations to secretly influence the minds of Americans. The CIA is now using several hundred American academics, administrators, faculty members, graduate students engaged in teaching, who, in addition to providing leads and, on occasion, making introductions for intelligence purposes, write books and other material to be used for propaganda purposes abroad. These academics are located in over 100 American colleges, universities, and related institutions. At the majority of institutions, no one other than the individual concerned is aware of the CIA link. At the others, at least one university official is aware of the operational use of academics on his campus. The CIA considers these operational relationships within the U.S. academic community as perhaps its most sensitive domestic area and has strict controls governing these operations. In 1961, the chief of the CIA's Covert Action Staff wrote that books were the most important weapon of strategic propaganda. The Church Committee found that more than 1,000 books were produced, subsidized, or sponsored by the CIA before the end of 1967. When Kissinger testified before the Church Committee about the bombing of Laos, orchestrated by the CIA as a secret activity, he said, "I do not believe in retrospect that it was a good national policy to have the CIA conduct the war in Laos. I think we should have found some other way of doing it." There was no indication that anyone on the committee challenged this idea, that what was done should have been done, but by another method. Thus, in 1974-1975, the system was acting to purge the country of its rascals and restore it to a healthy, or at least to an acceptable state. The resignation of Nixon, the succession of Ford, the exposure of bad deeds by the FBI and CIA, all aimed to regain the badly damaged confidence of the American people. However, even with these strenuous efforts, there were still many signs in the American public of suspicion, even hostility to the leaders of government, military, big business. 2 months after the end of the Vietnam War, only 20% of Americans polled thought the collapse of the Saigon government was a threat to United States security. June 14, 1975, was Flag Day, and President Gerald Ford spoke at Fort Benning, Georgia, where the Army staged a march, symbolizing its involvement in 13 wars. Ford commented that he was glad to see so many flags, but a reporter covering the event wrote, "Actually, there were few American flags to be seen near the president's reviewing stand. One, held aloft by demonstrators, bore an inked-in inscription saying, 'No more genocide in our name.' It was torn down by spectators as their neighbors applauded." That July, the Lou Harris poll, looking at the public's confidence in the government from 1966 to 1975, reported that confidence in the military during that period had dropped from 62% to 29%, in business from 55% to 18%, in both President and Congress from 42% to 13%. Shortly after that, another Harris poll reported that 65% of Americans oppose military aid abroad because they feel it allows dictatorships to maintain control over their population. Perhaps much of the general dissatisfaction was due to the economic state of most Americans. Inflation and unemployment had been rising steadily since 1973, which was the year when, according to a Harris poll, the number of Americans feeling alienated and disaffected with the general state of the country climbed from 29% in 1966 to over 50%. After Ford succeeded Nixon, the percentage of alienated was 55%. The survey showed that people were troubled most of all by inflation. In the fall of 1975, a New York Times survey of 1,559 persons and interviews with 60 families in 12 cities showed a substantial decline in optimism about the future. The Times reported, "Inflation, the apparent inability of the country to solve its economic problems, and a foreboding that the energy crisis will mean a permanent step backward for the nation's standard of living, have made inroads into America's confidence, expectations, and aspirations. Pessimism about the future is particularly acute among those who earn less than $7,000 annually, but it is also high within families whose annual incomes range from $10,000 to $15,000. There is also concern that no longer will hard work and a conscientious effort to save money bring them a nice home in the suburbs." Even higher income people, the survey found, are not as optimistic now as they were in past years, indicating that discontent is moving up from the lower middle income to higher economic levels. Around the same time, that fall of 1975, public opinion analysts testifying before a congressional committee reported, according to the New York Times, that public confidence in the government and in the country's economic future is probably lower than it has ever been since they began to measure such things scientifically. Government statistics suggested the reasons. The Census Bureau reported that from 1974 to 1975, the number of Americans legally poor, that is, below an income of $5,500, had risen 10% and was now 25.9 million people. Also, the unemployment rate, which had been 5.6% in 1974, had risen to 8.3% in 1975, and the number of people who exhausted their unemployment benefits increased from 2 million in 1974 to 4.3 million in 1975. Government figures, however, generally underestimated the amount of poverty, set the legally poor level too low, and underestimated the amount of unemployment. For instance, if 16.6% of the population averaged 6 months of unemployment during 1975, or 33.2% averaged 3 months of unemployment, the average annual figure given by the government was 8.3%, which sounded better. In the year 1976, with a presidential election approaching, there was worry in the establishment about the public's faith in the system. William Simon, Secretary of the Treasury under both Nixon and Ford, before then an investment banker earning over $2 million a year, spoke in the fall of 1976 to a business council meeting in Hot Springs, Virginia. He said that when so much of the world is lurching towards socialism or totalitarianism, it was urgent to make the American business system understood because private enterprise is losing by default. In many of our schools, in much of the communications media, and in a growing portion of the public consciousness. His speech could well be taken to represent the thinking of the American corporate elite. Vietnam, Watergate, student unrest, shifting moral codes, the worst recession in a generation, and a number of other jarring cultural shocks have all combined to create a new climate of questions and doubt. It all adds up to a general malaise, a society-wide crisis of institutional confidence. Too often, Simon said, Americans have been taught to distrust the very word profit and the profit motive that makes our prosperity possible, to somehow feel this system that has done more to alleviate human suffering and privation than any other is somehow cynical, selfish, and amoral. We must, Simon said, get across the human side of capitalism. As the United States prepared in 1976 to celebrate the bicentennial of the Declaration of Independence, a group of intellectuals and political leaders from Japan, the United States, and Western Europe organized into the Trilateral Commission, issued a report. It was entitled The Governability of Democracies. Samuel Huntington, a political science professor at Harvard University and longtime consultant to the White House on the war in Vietnam, wrote the part of the report that dealt with the United States. He called it the democratic distemper and identified the problem he was about to discuss. The 1960s witnessed a dramatic upsurge of democratic fervor in America. In the 60s, Huntington wrote, there was a huge growth of citizen participation in the forms of marches, demonstrations, protest movements, and cause organizations. There were also markedly higher levels of self-consciousness on the part of blacks, Indians, Chicanos, white ethnic groups, students, and women, all of whom became mobilized and organized in new ways. There was a marked expansion of white-collar unionism, and all this added up to a reassertion of equality as a goal in social, economic, and political life. Huntington pointed to the signs of decreasing government authority. The great demands in the 60s for equality had transformed the federal budget. In 1960, foreign affairs spending was 53.7% of the budget, and social spending was 22.3%. By 1974, foreign affairs took 33% and social spending 31%. This seemed to reflect a change in public mood. In 1960, only 18% of the public said the government was spending too much on defense, but in 1969, this jumped to 52%. Huntington was troubled by what he saw. The essence of the democratic surge of the 1960s was a general challenge to existing systems of authority, public and private. In one form or another, this challenge manifested itself in the family, the university, business, public and private associations, politics, the governmental bureaucracy, and the military services. People no longer felt the same obligation to obey those whom they had previously considered superior to themselves in age, rank, status, expertise, character, or talents. All this, he said, produced problems for the governability of democracy in the 1970s. Critical in all this was the decline in the authority of the president, and to the extent that the United States was governed by anyone during the decades after World War II, it was governed by the president, acting with the support and cooperation of key individuals and groups in the executive office, the federal bureaucracy, Congress, and the more important businesses, banks, law firms, foundations, and media, which constitute the private sector's establishment. This was probably the frankest statement ever made by an establishment advisor. Huntington further said that the president, to win the election, needed the support of a broad coalition of people. However, the day after his election, the size of his majority is almost, if not entirely, irrelevant to his ability to govern the country. What counts then is his ability to mobilize support from the leaders of key institutions in a society and government. This coalition must include key people in Congress, the executive branch, and the private sector establishment. He gave examples. Truman made a point of bringing a substantial number of nonpartisan soldiers, Republican bankers, and Wall Street lawyers into his administration. He went to the existing sources of power in the country to get help he needed in ruling the country. Eisenhower in part inherited this coalition and was in part almost its creation. Kennedy attempted to recreate a somewhat similar structure of alliances. What worried Huntington was the loss in governmental authority. For instance, the opposition to Vietnam had brought the abolition of the draft. The question necessarily arises, however, whether if a new threat to security should materialize in the future, as it inevitably will at some point, the government will possess the authority to command the resources as well as the sacrifices which are necessary to meet that threat. Huntington saw the possible end of that quarter century when the United States was the hegemonic power in a system of world order. His conclusion was that there had developed an excess of democracy, and he suggested desirable limits to the extension of political democracy. Huntington was reporting all this to an organization that was very important to the future of the United States. The Trilateral Commission was organized in early 1973 by David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski. Rockefeller was an official of the Chase Manhattan Bank and a powerful financial figure in the United States and the world. Brzezinski, a Columbia University professor, specialized in international relations and was a consultant to the State Department, as reported in the Far Eastern Economic Review, March 25, 1977, by Robert Manning. The initiative for the commission came entirely from Rockefeller. According to George Franklin, the commission's executive secretary, Rockefeller was getting worried about the deteriorating relations between the United States, Europe, and Japan. Franklin explained that Rockefeller began to present his ideas to another elite fraternity at the Bilderberg Group, a very distinguished Anglo-American group which has been meeting for a long time. Mike Blumenthal said he thought things were in a very serious condition in the world, and couldn't some kind of private group do more about it? So then David again made his proposal. Then Brzezinski, a close friend of Rockefeller's, carried the Rockefeller-funded ball and organized the commission. It seems probable that the very serious condition mentioned as the reason for the Trilateral Commission was the need for greater unity among Japan, Western Europe, and the United States, in the face of a much more complicated threat to tricontinental capitalism than a monolithic communism, revolutionary movements in the Third World. These movements had directions of their own. The Trilateral Commission wanted also to deal with another situation. Back in 1967, George Ball, who had been Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs in the Kennedy administration, and who was director of Lehman Brothers, a large investment banking firm, told members of the International Chamber of Commerce, "In these 20 post-war years, we have come to recognize in action, though not always in words, that the political boundaries of nation-states are too narrow and constricted to define the scope and activities of modern business. To show the growth of international economics for United States corporations, one would only have to note the situation in banking. In 1960, there were 8 United States banks with foreign branches. In 1974, there were 129. The assets of these overseas branches amounted to $3.5 billion in 1960, $155 billion in 1974. The Trilateral Commission apparently saw itself as helping to create the necessary international links for the new multinational economy. Its members came from the highest circles of politics, business, and the media in Western Europe, Japan, and the United States. They were from Chase Manhattan, Lehman Brothers, Bank of America, Banque de Paris, Lloyd's of London, Bank of Tokyo, etc. Oil, steel, auto, aeronautic, and electric industries were represented. Other members were from Time Magazine, the Washington Post, the Columbia Broadcasting System, Die Zeit, the Japan Times, the Economist of London, and more. 1976 was not only a presidential election year, it was the much anticipated year of the bicentennial celebration, and it was filled with much publicized events all over the country. The great effort that went into the celebration suggests that it was seen as a way of restoring American patriotism, invoking the symbols of history to unite people and government and put aside the protest mood of the recent past. But there did not seem to be great enthusiasm for it. When the 200th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party was celebrated in Boston, an enormous crowd turned out, not for the official celebration, but for the People's Bicentennial counter-celebration, where packages marked Gulf Oil and Exxon were dumped into the Boston Harbor to symbolize opposition to corporate power in America. Chapter 21, Carter, Reagan, Bush, the Bipartisan Consensus. Halfway through the 20th century, the historian Richard Hofstadter, in his book, The American Political Tradition, examined our important national leaders from Jefferson and Jackson to Herbert Hoover and the 2 Roosevelts, Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives. Hofstadter concluded that the range of vision embraced by the primary contestants in the major parties has always been bounded by the horizons of property and enterprise. They have accepted the economic virtues of capitalist culture as necessary qualities of man. That culture has been intensely nationalistic. Coming to the end of the century, observing its last 25 years, we have seen exactly that limited vision Hofstadter talked about. A capitalistic encouragement of enormous fortunes alongside desperate poverty, a nationalistic acceptance of war and preparations for war. Governmental power swung from Republicans to Democrats and back again, but neither party showed itself capable of going beyond that vision. After the disastrous war in Vietnam came the scandals of Watergate. There was a deepening economic insecurity for much of the population, along with environmental deterioration and a growing culture of violence and family disarray. Clearly, such fundamental problems could not be solved without bold changes in the social and economic structure. But no major party candidates proposed such changes. The American political tradition held fast. In recognition of this, perhaps only vaguely conscious of this, voters stayed away from the polls in large numbers or voted without enthusiasm. More and more they declared, if only by non-participation, their alienation from the political system. In 1960, 63% of those eligible to vote voted in the presidential election. By 1976, this figure had dropped to 53%. In a CBS News and New York Times survey, Over half of the respondents said that public officials didn't care about people like them. A typical response came from a plumber. The President of the United States isn't going to solve our problems. The problems are too big. There was a troubling incongruity in the society. Electoral politics dominated the press and television screens, and the doings of presidents, members of Congress, Supreme Court justices, and other officials were treated as if they constituted the history of the country. Yet there was something artificial in all this, something pumped up. A straining to persuade a skeptical public that this was all, that they must rest their hopes for the future in Washington politicians, none of whom were inspiring, because it seemed that behind the bombast, the rhetoric, the promises, their major concern was their own political power. The distance between politics and the people was reflected clearly in the culture. In what was supposed to be the best of the media, uncontrolled by corporate interest, that is, in public television, the public was largely invisible. On the leading political forum on public television, the nightly MacNeil-Lehrer Report, the public was uninvited, except as viewer of an endless parade of congressmen, senators, government bureaucrats, experts of various kinds. On commercial radio, the usual narrow band of consensus, excluding fundamental criticism, was especially apparent. In the mid-1980s, with Ronald Reagan as president, the fairness doctrine of the Federal Communications Commission, requiring airtime for dissenting views, was eliminated. By the 1990s, talk radio had perhaps 20 million listeners, treated to daily tirades from right-wing talk show hosts with left-wing guests, uninvited. A citizenry disillusioned with politics and with what pretended to be intelligent discussions of politics turned its attention, or had its attention turned, to entertainment, to gossip, to 10,000 schemes for self-help. Those at its margins became violent, finding scapegoats within one's group, as with poor black on poor black violence, or against other races, immigrants, demonized foreigners, welfare mothers, minor criminals, standing in for untouchable major criminals. There were other citizens, those who tried to hold on to ideas and ideals still remembered from the 60s and early 70s, not just by recollecting, but by acting. Indeed, all across the country, there was a part of the public, unmentioned in the media, ignored by political leaders, energetically active in thousands of local groups around the country. These organized groups were campaigning for environmental protection, or women's rights, or decent health care, including anguished concern about the horrors of AIDS, or housing for the homeless, or against military spending. This activism was unlike that of the 60s, when the surge of protest against race segregation and war became an overwhelming national force. It struggled uphill against callous political leaders trying to reach fellow Americans, most of whom saw little hope in either the politics of voting or the politics of protest. The presidency of Jimmy Carter, covering the years 1977 to 1980, seemed an attempt by one part of the establishment that represented in the Democratic Party to recapture a disillusioned citizenry. But Carter, despite a few gestures toward poor people, black people, despite talk of human rights abroad, remained within the historic political boundaries of the American system, protecting corporate wealth and power, maintaining a huge military machine that drained the national wealth, allying the United States with right-wing tyrannies abroad. Carter seemed to be the choice of that international group of powerful influence wielders, the Trilateral Commission. Two founding members of the commission, according to the Far Eastern Economic Review, David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski, thought Carter was the right person for the presidential election of 1976, given that the Watergate-plagued Republican Party was a sure loser. Carter's job as president, from the point of view of the establishment, was to halt the rushing disappointment of the American people with the government, with the economic system, with disastrous military ventures abroad. In his campaign, he tried to speak to the disillusioned and angry. His strongest appeal was to blacks, whose rebellion in the late 60s was the most frightening challenge to authority since the labor and unemployed upsurges in the 30s. His appeal was populist. That is, he appealed to various elements of American society who saw themselves beleaguered by the powerful and wealthy. Although he himself was a millionaire peanut grower, he presented himself as an ordinary American farmer. Although he had been a supporter of the Vietnam War until its end, he presented himself as a sympathizer with those who had been against the war, and he appealed to many of the young rebels of the 60s by his promise to cut the military budget. In a much publicized speech to lawyers, Carter spoke out against the use of the law to protect the rich. He appointed a black woman, Patricia Harris, as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and a black civil rights veteran, Andrew Young, as ambassador to the United Nations. He gave the job of heading the Domestic Youth Service Corps to a young former anti-war activist, Sam Brown. His most crucial appointments, however, were in keeping with the Trilateral Commission report of Harvard political scientist Samuel Huntington, which said that whatever groups voted for a president, once elected, what counts then is his ability to mobilize support for the leaders of key institutions. Brzezinski, a traditional Cold War intellectual, became Carter's national security advisor. His Secretary of Defense, Harold Brown, had, during the Vietnam War, according to the Pentagon Papers, envisaged the elimination of virtually all the constraints under which the bombing then operated. His Secretary of Energy, James Schlesinger, as Secretary of Defense under Nixon, was described by a member of the Washington Press Corps as showing an almost missionary drive in seeking to reverse a downward trend in the defense budget. Schlesinger was also a strong proponent of nuclear energy. His other cabinet appointees had strong corporate connections. A financial writer wrote not long after Carter's election, "So far, Mr. Carter's actions, commentary, and particularly his cabinet appointments, have been highly reassuring to the business community." Veteran Washington correspondent Tom Wicker wrote, "The available evidence is that Mr. Carter, so far, is opting for Wall Street's confidence." Carter did initiate more sophisticated policies toward governments that oppress their own people. He used United States Ambassador Andrew Young to build up goodwill for the United States among the black African nations, and urged that South Africa liberalize its policies towards blacks. A peaceful settlement in South Africa was necessary for strategic reasons. South Africa was used for radar tracking systems. Also, it had important U.S. corporate investments and was a critical source of needed raw materials, diamonds especially. Therefore, what the United States needed was a stable government in South Africa. The continued oppression of blacks might create civil war. The same approach was used in other countries, combining practical strategic needs with the advancement of civil rights. But because the chief motivation was practicality, not humanity, there was a tendency toward token changes, as in Chile's release of a few political prisoners. When Congressman Herman Badillo introduced in Congress a proposal that required the U.S. representatives to the World Bank and other international financial institutions to vote against loans to countries that systematically violated essential rights by the use of torture or imprisonment without trial, Carter sent a personal letter to every congressman urging the defeat of this amendment. It won a voice vote in the House, but lost in the Senate. Under Carter, the United States continued to support, all over the world, regimes that engaged in imprisonment of dissenters, torture, and mass murder. In the Philippines, in Iran, in Nicaragua, and in Indonesia, where the inhabitants of East Timor were being annihilated in a campaign bordering on genocide. The New Republic magazine, presumably on the liberal side of the establishment, commented approvingly on the Carter policies. American foreign policy in the next 4 years will essentially extend the philosophies developed in the Nixon Ford years. This is not at all a negative prospect. There should be continuity. It is part of history. Carter had presented himself as a friend of the movement against the war. But when Nixon mined Haiphong Harbor and resumed bombing of North Vietnam in the spring of 1973, Carter urged that we give President Nixon our backing and support, whether or not we agree with specific decisions. Once elected, Carter declined to give aid to Vietnam for reconstruction, despite the fact that the land had been devastated by American bombing. Asked about this at a press conference, Carter replied that there was no special obligation on the United States to do this because the destruction was mutual. Considering that the United States had crossed half the globe with an enormous fleet of bombers and 2 million soldiers, and after 8 years left a tiny nation with over 1 million dead and its land in ruins, this was an astounding statement. One establishment intention, perhaps, was that future generations see the war not as it appeared in the Defense Department's own Pentagon Papers, as a ruthless attack on civilian populations for strategic military and economic interests, but as an unfortunate error. Noam Chomsky, one of the leading anti-war intellectuals during the Vietnam period, looked in mid-1978 at how the history of the war was being presented in the major media, and wrote that they were destroying the historical record and supplanting it with a more comfortable story, reducing